This is a Fox News alert. We are awaiting a statement from police in Orlando. The Orange County Sheriff's Department there confirming multiple deaths after a shooting in an industrial area. Sheriff's Office says the situation is now contained. They do expect to have a live update very soon. You see the microphones, the podium there. We'll bring you more information as soon as we get it. And in international news, 6 Arab nations, now also the Maldives Islands, cutting diplomatic relations with the state of Qatar, accusing their neighbor of supporting terrorism and extremist groups backed by Iran. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom on this Monday morning. I'm Shannon Bream. Good morning.
Morning, Shannon. I'm Bill Hemmer. Good morning at home as well. The diplomatic crisis bound to cause many issues for many in the area, including the United States. Already, some of the biggest airlines in the Middle East suspending flights to Qatar as the coalition moves to isolate that nation's links to the outside world. Our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, weighing in on this just a short time ago.
What we're witnessing is a growing list of some irritants in the region that have been there for some time. We certainly would encourage the parties to sit down together and address these differences.
Rich Edson's live at the State Department. All right, Rich, one of the first questions that people had this morning was about how this could cause problems for the U.S.-led fight against ISIS.
Well, Shannon, when you look at what the U.S. strategy is, part of it is to get these Gulf countries to have better cooperation and further intensify their efforts against ISIS. This potentially makes that more difficult. If you look at the ties the U.S. has across the region, it has U.S. military assets across these countries. The coalition is using a key air base in Qatar, and so it's unclear how exactly these Gulf countries are going to try to use that air base when they've cut diplomatic ties with Qatar. The U.S. also hosts the forward headquarters of its central command there. That intended cooperation between these countries was on display a few weeks ago when President Trump traveled to Saudi Arabia. He addressed leaders of Arab countries and focused much of his speech on combating extremism in that part of the world. Now that alliance is fracturing as these countries turn against Qatar and suspend diplomatic, economic, and military ties. And so that is why Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, traveling in Australia, says he wants these countries to work out these issues.
A growing list of some irritants in the region that have been there for some time, and obviously they have now bubbled up to a level that countries decided they needed to take action in an effort to have those differences addressed. We certainly would encourage the parties to sit down together and address these differences. And if there's any role that we can play in terms of helping them address those, we think it is important that the GCC remain unified.
Yet the Saudi government is calling for all brotherly countries and companies to sever their diplomatic ties with Qatar. This has to do with long-standing regional power issues, a perception of Qatar that perhaps it is supporting Iran, that is the arch rival of Saudi Arabia in all this. The United Arab Emirates has released a statement on it severing ties with Qatar. It writes, quote, "The UAE is taking these decisive measures as a result of Qatar's continued support, funding, and hosting of terror groups, primarily Islamic Brotherhood, and its sustained endeavors to promote the ideologies of Daesh and al-Qaeda across its direct and indirect media." In a statement, Qatar called these allegations baseless and unfounded. Shannon.
All right, Rich Edson live for us at the State Department. Thank you, Rich.
A very significant story as that develops. Another Fox News alert right now. Back to London. New video of counterterrorism officers storming 2 new locations today and taking several people in for questioning. There is a massive investigation after Saturday night's deadly London attacks. Those raids coming as the British Prime Minister vows to push even harder against extremism in her country.
Nothing is more important than keeping our country safe. That is what strong leadership is about. Stepping up, facing up, and doing what's right for Britain. That is and will always be my approach.
So British investigators saying they now know the identities of Saturday's attackers. Their identity has not been made public. New reports show at least one of the suspects was well known to police. 7 people killed in the attacks on London Bridge and Borough Market. Nearly 50 others injured, many of them still fighting for their lives this morning. Team Fox coverage this hour on all that. Congressman Peter King in a moment to talk about preventing attacks here at home. But we begin with Greg Palcott live near the scene of Saturday's attacks with the latest on the investigation there. Greg.
And Bill, we are just outside of a police court of the terror site where a forensic investigation is continuing. This as raids are happening in two different locations away from here. Today, there were raids yesterday. All told, according to police, they have 11 people in custody. Those raids tied to where the attackers apparently live, so it is a sign that they know who these guys are. Already there is criticism of the authorities, however, surrounding one of the attackers. He is said to have been known to police. He's said to have been reported regarding extremist tendencies on two occasions, maybe that he was even recruiting children. ISIS claiming responsibility for the attack, and there was, in fact, a recommendation to ISIS supporters by the organization a few days prior to commit such an attack. Very similar, very eerie, Bill.
What are we hearing about the victims, Greg?
Well, stories like this, and we cover them a lot, unfortunately, just horrible to hear about these victims. Again, we are learning about the identity of one of the dead victims. That is 30-year-old Christine Archibald. She moved here from Canada to be with her fiancé here. She died in his arms on that London Bridge after having been slammed by the van of the attackers. All told, 36, we are told, remain in the hospital, 18 in critical condition, fighting for their lives. There are British victims, of course, as well as other nationalities. U.S. Embassy not confirming to us. Some reports out there that there could be an American hurt as well. Back to you, Bill.
And these are young attackers, young terrorists going after young people, much like we saw in Paris. Greg Palcott, thank you, live on the scene there. Shannon. Well,
Saturday's attack, the third in the UK just this year. President Trump's deputy assistant talking this morning about the challenges of preventing terrorism.
This is a global phenomenon. Radical Islamic terrorism isn't something confined to the Middle East. They wish to have world domination. They wish to incite violence on the land of what they see as the infidel. And ISIS is either controlling these attacks, training people, or inspiring them.
Congressman Peter King is on the House Homeland Security Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. Joins us now live. Good to see you, Congressman.
Thank you, Shannon.
So I talked with DHS Secretary Kelly on Saturday night, and he said to me that one of the things that's still a very major threat is the issue of aviation. He talked about geography and how that's one of the protecting barriers for us right now. But he said when it comes to the issue of aviation, they are still relentless. Those were his words. What do you see as the biggest threats here in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, Secretary Kelly is doing an outstanding job. He's right about aviation. I don't know how much we can say about it publicly, but he certainly is taking the measures that he feels are essential. And we have to always stay one step ahead of ISIS, one step ahead of al-Qaeda, because once they get the upper hand, it's going to be very, very dangerous for us. Secretary Kelly is on top of that. As far as what we face here, it's the threat from within. They could either be lone wolves or they could be people working in small networks, similar to what we saw in Manchester and London. And I think it's essential that the FBI and the police have coordinated efforts similar to what was done with the mob and the Westies. You have to have infiltration. You have to have constant surveillance because, again, you can have all the security in the world, but if that security shows up after the fact, the lives have already been lost. To head off the attack, you have to have intelligence. And you only get intelligence by either people cooperating or by having informers and undercovers working in those communities with constant surveillance. And if that involves going into mosques, so be it. We know the threat is coming from within the Muslim community, and that's where we have to focus on. But again, there's a myriad of things we have to do. But to me, if you ask me, one, it's to get surveillance, get intelligence, and to stop these attacks before they happen.
Well, and you know, though, when you say that we need to be inside mosques and we need to be surveilling from within, that sends up a lot of red flags to a lot of people who have civil liberties concerns and other monitoring concerns. You know that reaction is going to come. So how in the world do we walk that line with making sure that we don't offend a community that can be very helpful to rooting out the offenders within their midst and being able to get to the information that we need if those folks are themselves too threatened or too frightened to step forward?
Well, first of all, the people in the community should welcome the fact that the police are working to stop them because it's that community which gets affected the most. And again, when they went after the mafia, they infiltrated, I'm talking about the FBI and the police infiltrated the Italian-American communities. When they went after the Westies, they infiltrated the Irish communities. There was an Irish bar on the west side of Manhattan, I don't think, that didn't have undercovers. That's the way it has to be done. And I don't know why anyone in the community who wants to stop terrorism would be opposed to that. The NYPD has run this program for years. I know they've had to scale it back a bit because of court orders, but the fact is they stopped 15, 16 different attacks against New York. I don't believe anyone's civil liberties are violated. We're not talking about breaking and entering. We're not talking about doing anything without warrants. But again, you know, we're at war, and that's the reality here. And we can do it within the Constitution. We have to do it within the Constitution. But again, it's time to put political correctness aside. That's why I was so pleased yesterday when Prime Minister May used the term Islamic extremism. She used the word Islamist because that's where the threat is coming from. And another day it can come from a different group. But right now that's where it's coming from.
Well, are our law enforcement agencies here and those abroad in Europe, I mean, are they overwhelmed? Because we have a neighbor and a friend close to one of the suspected attackers in London. They haven't publicly released the names, but what we know so far. And both of them said they'd gone to law enforcement, one because he was worried about his friend getting radicalized by watching YouTube videos all day, and the other woman saying that she was a neighbor and that he was trying to radicalize the kids in the park. And yet law enforcement had that information, didn't do anything, but we know they're trying to track thousands of cases. Is it possible?
It's difficult, especially in England. It's difficult. They have a larger number percentage-wise than we do. But again, we've had it here in the United States with San Bernardino and Orlando, where we know that the law enforcement had gotten information, they gotten tips, but they were required to close down their investigations after 6 months. At least the FBI was. In Boston, we know that the FBI had information and didn't share it with the local police, with the Tsarnaev brothers before the Boston Marathon. No, it's very tough. It is tough to do, but that's why you need people on the ground. You need people monitoring this. So you can't have a police officer following that guy every day when you get a tip on him. But if you have somebody living in the community, someone who belongs to the organizations he does, he or she can monitor that person and get back to the police.
Well, Secretary Kelly had great praise for the men and women of DHS and law enforcement here in the U.S. and said, we have no idea, and maybe you have a better idea than we do of just what they're facing every day and how successful they've been. Congressman Peter King, good to see you.
Thank you, Shannon. Again, General Kelly is doing an outstanding job. Great American.
Thanks, sir.
We have so much more to learn from London. In light of this latest attack, President Trump now renewing his calls for courts to move on the travel ban, calling it vital in keeping the U.S. safe.
We're also taking decisive action to improve our vetting procedures. The courts are not helping us, I have to be honest with you. It's ridiculous. To keep criminals and terrorists the hell out of our country.
So that was from March, and today we've got a number of messages from the president by way of Twitter, why he's now pushing the Justice Department to take action on that travel order.
And it's going to be must-see TV. Former FBI Director James Comey getting ready to testify on Capitol Hill this week. Britt Hume explains what it could mean for the Russia investigation. But first, here's what Senator Lindsey Graham had to say.
Here's what I worry about, that he'll just focus on his conversation with the president and not answer any other questions because of the investigation. That would be a hit job on President Trump, and I hope this hearing doesn't become a hit job.
This news broke about an hour ago. Fox's Alert now awaiting a statement from police in Orlando, Florida. The Sheriff's Department, Orange County, confirming multiple deaths after a shooting in what is described as an industrial area. Sheriff's Office saying the situation is now contained. They expect to have a live update any moment now, so we're watching the camera and the microphone down there in Central Florida. More information on that as soon as we get it here on America's Newsroom.
You have former Director Comey and the acting director both have said there have been no impediments, no political influence. So it's pretty hard for them to come back now and say, well, there was political influence by the president when they previously testified under oath saying that there had been.
Congressman Jason Chaffetz earlier on Fox and Friends looking ahead to Thursday's expected testimony by former FBI Director James Comey. It would be his first public testimony since the time he was fired by President Trump. Let's talk about it with Britt Hume, Fox News senior political analyst. Good morning, Britt.
Good morning, Shannon.
All right, should we get our hopes up for any blockbuster statements, or do you think it's going to be a little bit muted on Thursday?
Well, I think it's going to be a media extravaganza of a kind that we've often seen in the past with congressional hearings, which have a habit of not quite living up to the billing that they received. Everybody will be watching. But remember a few things about this. First of all, Comey will be under whatever strictures Robert Mueller placed on him about discussions of the ongoing investigation. He will also be unable to testify about classified information. And let's remember, Shannon, that this investigation that he was leading was primarily, and has been described as such, as a counterintelligence investigation, which is to say that its intent was to find out what Russia tried to do to influence the election. Part of that, of course, was the question of whether there was collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign. So far, no evidence has come to the surface, at least, of that. And so we're going to get down to the question of what was said in that meeting between the president and Mr. Comey, which was, only two people in the room. And Comey has said, Shannon, that the president asked him if he could ease up on Michael Flynn, which sounds pretty bad. But in order for that to amount to obstruction of justice, it would have to be viewed as something that was done with a corrupt intent, corruptly influencing the investigation. And it seems if that were the case, we would have heard about it from Comey before, and we haven't.
Yeah, it does raise the question, if it was so egregious, why we didn't hear about it at the time. Now, as to those conversations, the FBI has not, they declined to release any Comey memos if they exist. We've understood, not from Mr. Comey himself, but from close associates and reports that allegedly he did put a lot of things into memoranda after the conversations. Senator Collins, who is Republican, says that she wants to know the tone, the exact words, and the context of these conversations, because that is so important. Do you think the former FBI director, Britt, will get into those kinds of details?
Well, I think he's pretty free to talk about the meeting with the president. I don't see any impediment to that. That might be part of the ongoing investigation, but we're not sure that it is. The ongoing investigation, after all, is supposed to be about what the Russians did, not what Mr. Trump did after the election was over. So I think he'll be pretty free to talk about that. And, of course, once he's talked about it, there's no reason why he can't answer questions about tone of voice, exact words, and all the rest of it. So we'll probably get a full sense of it. You have the feeling, based on the fact that he didn't react to what Trump told him by doing anything with regard to the investigation, or, threatening to quit, which he's done in the past in certain situations, that he's going to say, look, I took it as he was asking if I could see my way clear to easing up on Flynn. He just fired the guy. He felt bad about it. Which would be inappropriate, perhaps, but not obstruction of justice, and probably not, that big a deal. We'll see.
I want to quickly ask you about the travel ban case now pending before the Supreme Court. A lot made. Listen, the lower court decisions were made in great deal based on the president's comments during the campaign. And a lot of folks have started to raise questions about Justice Ginsburg, comments she made during the campaign. I want to read one of them to you. This was a New York Times interview back in July 2016, talking about if Donald Trump was to become president, saying, I can't imagine what this place would be. I can't imagine what the country would be with Donald Trump as our president. For the country, it could be 4 years. For the court, it could be, I don't even want to contemplate that. And that's just one of many conversations and interviews she had around time period. I note that you've made note of that as well, because that case now sits before her.
Well, and that's not even that comment was pretty strong medicine, but that wasn't the harshest thing she said. She said worse things about Donald Trump, which does raise the question of whether it's appropriate for her, having expressed these opinions about him as president, to then be sitting on a case in which he is the plaintiff. I guess he's the appellant. So what I would say about that is that the Supreme Court's restrictions or strictures that have to do with recusals are not as strong as they are for certain other judges. So she's free to sit on the case if she wants to. It doesn't look good. My guess is she'll sit on it anyway because, so that's where we are. Whether it's proper or not is another question.
Got to leave it there, Britt. Thank you so much.
4 days since the Paris climate withdrawal. Democrats, are they losing their minds? Al Gore.
Well, we have seen a decline in emissions for on a global basis. For the first time, they've stabilized and started to decline. So some of the responses of the last 10 years have helped. But unfortunately and regrettably, a lot of serious damage has been done.
So there was Al Gore blasting President Trump's move on with getting out of the Paris climate deal. And what Chris Wallace's question was prior to that answer was rather interesting. Former Governor of New Hampshire, John Sununu, is here to talk about this. And Governor, good day to you on a Monday morning here.
Hey, Bill, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So our audience knows Chris Wallace said, didn't you warn in 2006 that we'd be facing drastic measures, that the world would reach a point of no return within 10 years? Then Wallace says, well, now it's been 11 years. The former vice president's answer is that globally we have reduced emissions, and that could explain why we've gotten a break. What did you think of that whole exchange, Governor?
Bill, the apocalyptic predictions started in the mid-'80s, late '80s. We've been 10 years away from disaster since 1985, 86, 87, 88. It obviously hasn't happened. It's amazing to me that all the fluff up we are looking at now is coming from people like Gore, like John Kerry. By the way, the predecessor to the Paris Accords was the Kyoto Protocol. When the Kyoto Protocol had a chance to be voted on as a treaty in the Senate, it lost 95-0, and Senator Kerry was one of the ones that opposed the Kyoto Treaty. This is all hypocrisy. It's all sophistry. Even beyond whether you want to fight about what's happening or not happening, this treaty was a non-treaty because the president didn't want to bring it to Congress. But when you look at the details of it, even those that supported it said it wouldn't have any impact.
No, this wasn't Kyoto. Kyoto was slightly different, obviously, but Kyoto, as you're right, went down 95-0 in the U.S. Senate. You invoked John Kerry's name a couple times. This is what he said on Sunday about the withdrawal.
When Donald Trump says to the world, well, we're going to negotiate a better deal, I mean, you know, he's going to go out and find a better deal. That's like O.J. Simpson saying he's going to go out and find the real killer.
How about that comparison, Governor?
Look, let's look at, I told you, Kerry was one of the ones that voted against Kyoto. But let's look at the details of the deal that Trump did walk us out of. It was a deal that had restrictions on a voluntary basis. It even exempted China and India from even the voluntary restrictions that they would impose on themselves for 20 years. And then the key component that nobody's been talking about is that it would require the United States and a few of the other developed countries to send $100 billion a year to the undeveloped countries. That was the sweetener that they put in there to buy the vote of the undeveloped countries to support this.
Yeah,
it was a dumb piece. It was a dumb piece of international accommodation, and Donald Trump put the reality to it that it should not continue.
We just focused on John Kerry and Al Gore. Were you surprised at the reaction and, frankly, the reporting after the decision of last Thursday?
Well, I'm never surprised at the reporting of the left anymore, but let's take some of the reactions. You know, the Elon Musk, this is the Elon Musk that the Los Angeles Times pointed out has built his business empire on $5 billion worth of subsidies from the U.S. government on programs that are...
Are they losing their minds?
Multiple deaths after a shooting in an industrial area. The sheriff's office now saying the situation is contained. They're going to bring us a live update that's expected within just minutes. We're going to take you there as soon as we get more information.
President Trump speaking out repeatedly today about the weekend's deadly terror attacks in London, vowing to do whatever it takes to prevent anything like that from happening here. This from last night.
This bloodshed must end. This bloodshed will end. As president, I will do what is necessary to prevent this threat from spreading to our shores and work every single day to protect the safety and security of our country, our communities, and our people.
That from last night in Washington, this now from London today. Investigators raiding 2 new London locations today in a massive hunt for any possible terror networks in that city. 7 people killed, dozens injured on Saturday night. The police chief saying they now know who carried out the brutal attacks. They will not release the suspects' names as of this hour. One of the attackers reportedly known to police before the attack, and the Prime Minister saying it's time to take tougher action today against terrorists.
As the threat evolves, our response must do so too. We cannot go on as we are. Enough is enough. We must do more, much more, to take on and defeat the evil ideology of Islamist extremism.
Ed Davis, former Boston Police Commissioner, Fox News contributor here now. And sir, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Police responded, killed all 3 within 8 minutes. They have changed their posture. How much so? and is it enough?
Well, they truly have. Prior to 9/11, I visited London, worked with the London police, and they were the epitome of community police officers, famously unarmed, dealing with all sorts of urban crime, but without access to weapons. And since 9/11, the numbers of armed officers have increased. It's still only about 10% of the force, but especially in the Westminster and the downtown area, they are prepared for anything. And you can see with this response, 8 minutes, taking all three of these guys out in a very controlled manner. There was one other person injured, but no one else from the gunfire. And over 50 rounds were fired. And you know, the other thing that happened that night was a young police officer, only 2 years on the job, kind of wading into this situation against three armed suspects with what appeared to be explosive devices strapped to them. He only had a baton and did an incredible job of fighting with them, saving other people from being stabbed. He was stabbed himself. He's in the hospital now. But there's been some really incredible police work that's
soft
happened in the
targets.
last few days.
I mean, they're everywhere, right? Thousands and thousands in every major city around the world. My take is that, you know, these terrorists went after people their own age. You know, at night, having a good time, hanging out in the pub, much like we saw in Paris from a year earlier. Judith Miller writes this at foxnews.com, on screen now. This type of low-tech but lethal terrorism is likely to happen again. What counts once an attack occurs is, first, how quickly the police respond, and second, how quickly the Brits return to normal, albeit the new normal. From what we now know, the police responded superbly. This is what was sent out late on Saturday night, okay? It was run, hide, tell. And the tell aspect is tell police by calling 999 when it is safe to do so. Do we do this, or is our system different, sir?
No, this is a takeoff on the system that was developed here at the Department of Homeland Security. Our system is run, hide, and fight. And we train corporate companies with this mantra from DHS. The great part of that is that people have an understanding that it's best to get away from an incident first. If they can't get away from it, they should secrete themselves and try to hide. And in the last possible scenario, if it's impossible to hide, you know, you take a message from the Marines and you charge the target. You fight, and sometimes, tragically, that's the only way out. We saw that happen in these attacks.
When you teach this to others, how do they respond to that message?
They're actually relieved. I've had clients tell me that they were really confused as to what to do, but after our training, they actually understand what they should do if they're in a mall, for instance, or if they're in a workplace environment. Exactly how to respond to the sound of gunfire to a situation developing. Save yourself. Get yourself away from there. Hide if you can, and fight if ultimately that's the only thing you can do.
Davis, thank you for your time out of Boston today. Good to have you back on our program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, a big announcement in the next hour. President Trump unveiling plans to reform the nation's air traffic control system. Senior counselor Kellyanne Conway earlier calling it part of the president's plan to revitalize the nation's infrastructure.
When he was president-elect and now as president, he has made very clear his commitment to improving infrastructure. We don't build anything anymore as a country, that our roads and our bridges are in disrepair. So it's just a very exciting thing that people will literally see the fruits of those promises beginning today.
The proposal calls for privatizing the system to help speed up the introduction of new technology without getting bogged down by federal bureaucracy. We'll carry the president's announcement. It's supposed to start live at 11:30 a.m. Eastern.
Before we get to that, President Trump returning to another campaign promise. Remember this?
The time is overdue to develop a new screening test for the threats we face today. I call it extreme vetting.
So that was from August of last year, and what he's now saying today about his push for a temporary travel ban. The judge, Anna Napolitano, has that next.
Plus, the Orange County Sheriff's Department should be updating us momentarily on a deadly shooting spree in the Orlando area. Multiple fatalities have been reported. Details coming up. President Trump doubling down on his call for the courts to stop blocking his temporary travel ban, tweeting earlier this morning, people, the lawyers, and the courts can call it whatever they want, but I am calling it what we need and what it is, a travel ban. And the Justice Department should have stayed with the original travel ban, not the watered-down, politically correct version they submitted to the Supreme Court. And the Justice Department should ask for an expedited hearing of the watered-down travel ban before the Supreme Court and seek a much tougher version. Let's talk about it with Judge Andrew Napolitano, Fox News senior judicial analyst. Judge, good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm smiling because the version that is before the Supreme Court is his version.
Right, 2.0.
It's his second executive order, which he signed and which rescinded the first one, because the first one had too many references to religion in it and circumstances under which the religion should be taken into account and the religion should be exempted. It's not like it's a statute that he reluctantly signed. It's his to create.
It dropped a rock as well, taking it from 7 countries to 6.
Yes, so look, we have a case in the Ninth Circuit which has not yet been ruled on. We can probably guess which way the Ninth Circuit's going to go, but hasn't done it yet. We have a case in the Fourth Circuit which went against the president. That's the one that they appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's not going to do anything until they hear from the Ninth Circuit, and it might not do anything even then, because these cases are in the preliminary status. These are preliminary restraints. These are not decisions made by judges and juries or judges after taking testimony. And as you know, the Supreme Court doesn't like to rule until the cases below it are completed. So it's a procedural mishmash, and we don't know which way it's going to go. I'll tell you what the president wants. The president doesn't care how long the trials below take. He just wants his order to be in place during the pendency of all that litigation.
And the thing is, the order is so short. We're talking about 90 days over one category, 120 days over another category. So even if the ban was lifted, it's likely the ban would be over by the time these things ever got to trial.
If the ban had taken effect when he signed that order, it would be over now, because he signed it more than 90 and more than 120 days ago.
Exactly.
So we really don't know which way the court is going to go on this. My own view is the court is not going to change its jurisprudence for this, no matter how compelling is the desire of the administration to have the travel ban in place. It is interesting that he started to call it a travel ban, though. His critics have called it that, and now he's taken up that mantra.
It's sort of like when we had Obamacare, and for a long time the White House wouldn't call it that, and then at some point it was sort of accepted by the Democrats and by, okay, it's Obamacare. Right. Okay, so back to this. We know that next week the Supreme Court has asked the parties who oppose the request for the court to rule on this. Next Monday, they have to file their briefs. In the meantime, we talked with Brit Hume earlier about this today, the fact that Justice Ginsburg had a lot to say during the campaign season
boy, did she ever.
About President Trump and what would happen if he was elected. She expressed what many people would interpret as a great apprehension and displeasure. And so if these courts are going to rule based on what he said during the campaign, can they take into account what she said? No one can recuse a Supreme Court justice except for the justice themselves.
Right.
So only she would have to say.
And Britt made that point very nicely, and it's really unfair because the rules that the Supreme Court imposes on all other federal judges, it doesn't impose on itself. So if Justice Ginsburg were a federal trial judge or a Circuit Court of Appeals judge and had said about the president what she did, she would be compelled by a higher court not to sit on a case in which the president was personally involved. Not so with the Supreme Court. I mean, if she sits in the case and her animus towards him as a person, as a human being, is manifest in the questioning or in the decision of the case, that will damage the reputation of the court. But she will still be able to sit on the case and exercise her views about him. Hopefully she can put aside what she said about him and rule just on the merits of the case, which would be, can the president do this under the Constitution and under the statutes?
So quickly, you don't think that the Supreme Court will weigh in before we get a little bit more activity from the lower courts?
Yes, okay. I do believe that. You probably agree. It's the standard thinking today. On the other hand, there's a political mechanism going on here. The president and the DOJ had to file their appeal within a certain period of time. They have to keep rowing this boat. It can't look like they're giving up the ghost. So I don't begrudge them for filing that appeal, even though in my view they filed it way too early.
He's going to keep on tweeting. Either way, Judge, you know that. And we'll stand by and wait to hear from the Supremes. Good to hear from you.
Pleasure.
Phil.
Shannon, thank you. The media's had quite a few days. Wow, from Bill Maher to CNN to numerous apologies. Howie Kurtz has been watching all of it. He's live next in a moment to tell you what you need to know.
Trump set to make a major announcement on his plan to update America's infrastructure. How air traffic control plays a part. Plus, a rally turns into a riot when clashes over President Trump erupt in Poland. And multiple fatalities in a shooting in Orlando. Police just updating this developing story, the latest in the investigation, when Melissa Francis joins me for Happening Now, top of the hour.
John, thank you. See you in 8 minutes. In the meantime, CNN's under scrutiny as it rebuts claims that a reporter staged a shot to be sympathetic to Muslims during coverage of the London terror attacks. Now, Howard Kerr's been watching a lot of this now, Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media. Howie, good morning to you.
Good morning.
You had a Bill Maher apology over the weekend, too, from a comment he made on air. And you've got Reza Aslan, who works for CNN. He sent out a tweet. It had profane language, and then he was forced to apologize. And here's what he said. I should not have used a profanity to describe the president when responding to his shocking reaction to the London attacks. My statement, and there it follows. What do we make of this, Howie?
First of all, that is a very half-hearted apology, because not only in the original tweet did Reza Aslan call the President of the United States a piece of excrement, using a four-letter word, but he also called him a stain on the presidency and an embarrassment to humankind. And this guy hosts a show on CNN, which doesn't appear to be taking any action, put out a statement saying, well, he's not really an employee. By the way, Kathy Griffin isn't either. She appears once a year. And it's never appropriate to use this kind of language. I think we're seeing here, Bill, the normalizing of extreme rhetoric from media commentators and others against this president.
The normalizing.
Well, you look at Kathy Griffin holding up the severed head. Now, she did pay a price for that. She apologized, and then she attacked the Trump family and said that she was the victim here for something she had done. You see a language here by Reza Aslan and others. And there's a whole litany now. I find myself writing and talking about this virtually every week. And by the way, you know, it's fine for the media to criticize, critique, be aggressive about what Donald Trump does as president, his policies, his statements, his tweets. That's all fair game. But when you get into some of this incredibly vicious personal stuff, embarrassment to humankind, you wonder how these people can even pretend to be objective or even fair if they're commentators.
So look at this other matter. This involved a CNN reporter in London, and the way I understand it is these reporters had a police line, and there were several protesters who were invited to come on the other line of the police line, and then they were showed on camera saying that, love London, etc. Now, you've watched this video, Howard. How do you see this?
Well, I'm inclined to buy CNN's explanation, which is that it was the police that was letting these protesters into a media area. And look, you know how it works when a TV crew goes to cover a protest. You want shots of protesters with signs. I didn't see anything in this video that indicated that CNN correspondent or any crew members were encouraging the protesters to do anything or to say anything. So I think on this one, doesn't quite get my outrage meter going the way some of this extreme rhetoric does in these other cases.
Did you talk about Bill Maher in your show over the weekend? Because
absolutely,
he's apologized, and what is his fate now on all this, Howie?
Well, you know, to some extent, it's been overshadowed by the Kathy Griffin uproar. Also, he didn't call anybody the N-word. He kind of talked about himself as it. Still, that word is completely and totally unacceptable, and I'm glad he apologized. But HBO, you know, gives its artists a lot of freedom. I don't see as much of a backlash. By the way, if any of this was directed at, let's say, Barack Obama, using some of the language that Reza Aslan used, there would be a media uproar. I doubt that person would still be employed.
The New York Times wrote a piece today defending Bill Maher. Wow.
Wow, indeed.
That's something else, Howie. So well, he's going to keep his job then, right?
I don't see any groundswell for him to get rid of his job. I think the apology may have taken some of the sting out of it. He said it was a moment of banter. He went too far. Sometimes comedians do go too far. But there certainly seems to be almost an epidemic of this right now, Bill.
Thank you, Howard. Howard Kurtz watching all that. We need two of you.
So do I.
Thanks, Shannon.
Well, the news is coming in. Several people are dead following a shooting spree in Orlando. We're going to hear from the Sheriff's Department in just a minute. We'll give you that update live when it starts.